Hi everyone. In today's module, we're going to talk about the physiology of acute pain. So this is the first module. We're really going to start to get into the science that underlies this pain experience that we have. Now, as we begin, it's important for us to start to define some terms. Now, one of the terms we're going to define is the term pain. Now, for us, is pain and this other term, nociception, are they really the same thing? Because in the past, traditionally, pain and nociception have been used somewhat interchangeably. But I think that as sciences start to evolve around pain, and we've learned more and more about pain, we realize that nociception and pain are really completely different concepts. And we'll explain the reason why as we go through today's module. And by the end of the module today, hopefully you'll understand what the big difference is between this concept of pain and nociception, because they really are not interchangeable terms. They're completely different. So as we start to get into the science of pain, we start to define the difference between nociception and pain, we realize that nociception really is this term that we use to indicate that tissue has been injured. Nociception is really an indication of acute injury, and acute can result in acute pain because it's really a warning sign. It's telling us that something is wrong with our body, something's injured, and it really warns our body and tells our body that we should protect it, rest it, and not disturb so that it has a chance to heal. Now, when we start to look at this concept of nociception, really there's some peripheral mechanisms that get injured or disrupted in people with injury. So we're going to discuss some of those right now. So nociception is this concept that thinks the tissue is injured. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, stepping on a Lego, how much pain are you in? Now, I have kids and I've stepped on plenty of Legos, and I know it causes excruciating pain. Now, what happens when we step on that Lego that causes this pain? Now, what is one of the first things that occurs in our body when we injure ourselves? Well, all of us know that when we injure ourselves, one of the first things that happens is that we start to swell up. We get injury to a tissue, whether we sprain our ankle or hurt our knee or cut our hand. We all experience that. The first thing that happens is we get this swelling that occurs. Now, what's the purpose of this swelling? Well, the purpose of the swelling is a couplefold. One of the reasons that we swell is that it brings in tissue that will help us heal up. But also, one of the most important things is that it brings in cells that will help us prevent infection, fight bacteria, fight things that might be invading our body. So really, the purpose of healing is twofold. One, it helps bring in the cells that are necessary to build up and repair our tissue. Second, it brings in the cells that are necessary to fight and protect against foreign invaders. But really, one of the third things it does is it also brings in different chemicals that helps to sensitize certain nerves or allow those nerves to fire more rapidly, and allow these nerves, the purpose is to protect. It's a warning sign that our body utilizes to help us to rest an area and tell us that we shouldn't be using an area so it can heal up properly. So inflammation does all these things. Protects, brings in healing material, and brings in things to help fight foreign invaders. Now, how does it do it? Well, it does it by bringing in different chemical mediators. Now, these mediators that are brought in, there are a lot of them. And I'm not expecting you to memorize all these, but you'll have to realize that you're going to hear a lot of these chemicals and a lot of these neurotransmitters and mediators as we start to talk about the mechanisms that are involved in pain, and also the different ways that our interventions and the way we manage people influence the pain and the nociception and the healing that people have. So some important ones I want to highlight off this screen would be histamines and serotonin. You'll hear these two types of mediators expressed and talked about quite a bit as we go through the different modules. Bradykinins are important as well. You'll see prostaglandins are important in this process as well. And the different leukotrienes and cytokines, you'll hear a lot about that as you start to get into more pharmacological types of modules. But there's also other inflammatory mediators beyond those that we need to talk about. Things like substance P, glutamate, GABA, glycine, opioids. We already talked about serotonin. And there's also norepinephrine. All these are released when a tissue is injured into the site of injury. And the important thing is that we're realizing as we study more and more and do more and more research about this inflammatory process and how it influences pain, that a lot of these substances are prevalent in our environment, in the foods we eat, and the different things that we do. And so there's a lot of ways potentially that we can start to modify and modulate these different chemicals in our body to reduce pain. And these are important reasons that we need to know these inflammatory mediators, because they help us figure out ways to manage. So of these different chemicals and different modulators or mediators right now, pay close attention to things like substance P, glutamate, GABA, serotonin. And for those who are following the news, opioids are a big thing as well. So that's the inflammatory process that we all see after we injure ourselves. But what we don't see is the things that set in process that result in pain. What we don't see is the nerves that transmit this information to the brain. So all those chemical mediators that you see, what they do, not all of them, but a good portion of these, what they do is they open up channels in our receptors. And what these channels at our receptors they do is then they allow nerve impulses to be propagated up towards our spine, and from our spine up to our brain. So the important thing to realize is all these different chemical mediators, what they do is they affect our threshold for an action potential to be propagated. And so what they do is they open up these channels, and once they're open, they allow for the propagation or the firing of an action potential. And once these action potentials are fired, then pain is propagated, or the nociception is propagated up from the periphery, up towards the spine, and up towards the brain. So what special nerves do we have that transmit this information? Well, actually we have a couple of special nerves. In the past they've been called pain nerves, but in reality they're not pain nerves at this point, because we remember that pain occurs after processing of signals to the brain happens. So really, these are nociceptive nerves, and what we call them is nociceptive specific neurons. Now there's two primary groups of nociceptive specific neurons. One is called C fibers, and the second is called A delta fibers. C fibers are responsible for transmitting information about heat and chemical stimulus, where A delta fibers are responsible for propagating information or transmitting information about noxious stimulus or mechanical stimulus like pressure stimulus. We'll start with C fibers of these nociceptive specific neurons, because we call them nociceptive, but that's really a kind of a misnomer. And I'll tell you why in a second. When we start to take a look at C fibers, they're actually the most numerous sensory fiber in the body. A majority of these are nociceptive, but also realize that a lot of C fibers are not specific to pain, not specific to nociception. What they are they're chemical messenger systems that can respond to a lot of different types of stimulus, nociception being one of the primary ones, but they can also respond to other types of stimulus. They're most sensitive to thermal and chemical stimulation, like we talked about. What's also interesting is that they're subthalamic, and we'll talk about the importance of that in a second. As we talk about it, you'll see that C fibers are more messengers. They're not necessarily, at this point, pain transmitters, because of the fact that they synapse subthalamically. One of the primary things they do is they regulate our autonomic nervous system and our autonomic responses. And that's important, because what it does is it transmits information up to the areas of our brain that are subthalamic, like our brainstem and reticular formations. And from there, what it does is it sets up this autonomic fight or flight response. So it gets our bodies ready to get away from whatever it is that's causing the damage. And that's an important, quick subconscious process that occurs. The second thing to realize that it's unmyelinated. So what it does is it sends information up, but a little bit more slowly than our A delta fibers. It's responsible for this dull achiness that we experience after we've injured ourselves. And really, if you're interested, it transmits at about 0.5 to 2 meters per second. So relatively slowly when you start to consider the speed in which nerves transmit information. So that's the C fiber. And recap, it's synapse is subthalamic, meaning that it's really not directly responsible for pain. It's more of a messenger system. And what does it message? It warns our autonomic system that they need to respond to a threat that's occurring somewhere in our body. Now we get to our A delta fibers. The A delta fibers are interesting because they are really more responsible for our first initial responses to pain. It's responsible for the first pain we feel, and it's responsible for the first and quickest amount of information that's propagated up to the brain from the periphery. They're less numerous than C fibers, and they're sensitive to mechanical or pressure stimulation, mainly. So that's what we talked about earlier. The important key aspects are they're suprathalamic. That means what they do is they synapse directly on the thalamus, and so they synapse within the brain itself, not below it. They do cause pain because pain is something that occurs in the brain. They're myelinated, so they occur more. Their signals reach the brain more rapidly, and they're responsible for really this first sharp pain that we experience when we step on the Lego. They propagate at 50 or 5 to 30 seconds per meters per second, 5 to 30 meters per second, which is really a lot quicker than you'll see the C fibers. Now, if we start to look at how they time in, really, if I step on that Lego or have any type of injury, we're going to feel the A deltas kick on really quickly. So it will be responsible for this quick pain as it goes down. This very quick, sharp pain that occurs. But you'll see that it also, from a timing perspective, it goes on and it goes off relatively quickly. Once it starts to go off, you'll see the C fibers start to reach the brain. So what it does is it goes to the regions below the brainstem, not regions below the brainstem, regions below the thalamus first, and then it needs to be routed from there up to the thalamus into the brain. So it takes a little bit more time for that to occur. We'll talk about those mechanisms in a second, but realize that as the A delta fibers start to shut down, the C fibers start to kick in, but also remember that it's more of a messenger system, a warning system. So rather than the first A deltas, which are more sharp, then you kick in the C fibers that are more of a warning, warning. And this is important because you realize that as you go through, the C fibers, they can stay on for long periods of time, and they're responsible for this dull achiness that occurs. And so it's more of a warning sign that can go on for long periods of time, which may be an important piece of information as we start to deal with people after acute injuries, but also as we start to look at people with chronic pain. So once we get from the periphery, those nociceptive-specific neurons, they transmit information and they synapse at the spinal cord. But they don't synapse all over the spinal cord. They synapse in a specific region of the spinal cord called the substantia gelatinosa. Now, the spinal cord itself, if we start to look at the areas where it synapses, it's really broken into this concept or categorized and by the region it's located. They've termed this the rexid lamina. And so the lamina system, it really tells you where different types of nerves will synapse and then be propagated up through the spinal cord. So for pain, it is what I said, it was the substantia gelatinosa, but in terms of the lamina, they're classified as lamina 1 and 2. So if you look at that picture on the right, you'll see the Roman numeral 1 and 2. That's typically where these nociceptive specific neurons, both the C fibers and the A delta fibers, they go to synapse and then they'll transmit information up. Sometimes it also go into lamina 3, primarily 1 and 2. So once it synapses that area, it's propagated up through the spinal cord. And through the spinal cord, what it does is it goes up specific pathways. Now, if you're studying your neurology and your neurophysiology, you'll get these different pathways. Now, the one that transmits primarily the information from the A delta fibers are the spinal thalamic tract. Now, the spinal thalamic tract is the one classically linked with the transmission of pain. But even though it's linked with the transmission of pain, realize it's the A deltas that synapse to it, and so it propagates information up. But beyond the spinal thalamic tract, there's also several other tracts that propagate pain. There's multiple ones beyond the ones that I'm listing here, but these are the primary ones that I want you to know. The C fibers, they synapse at various regions. Remember, they synapse subthalamically, so in this case it synapses in the brainstem and in the reticular formations and in the perioccipital gray and in the hypothalamus. So these are named after where they synapse. So the C fibers will transmit information to the reticular formation, and this is through the spinal reticular tract. They'll transmit information to the perioccipital gray, and this is through the spinal mesencephalic tract. The C fibers will also transmit information up to the hypothalamus, and they'll do this through the spinal hypothalamic tract. So these are the main tracts that transmit information about nociception and pain up to the brain. So these are typically considered the mechanisms that occur cortically and subcortically. These have been knowledge that we've gained over many, many years. The exciting thing in pain science are the things that we're learning about the brain and pain that occurs within the brain and within the subcortical regions. This is what has been the biggest advances in pain science, and so we're going to share some of these things with you right now. So the cortical processing of nociception, realize that whether it goes directly to the brain or it routes through subcortical structures like the perioccipital gray, the reticular formations, eventually they're all routed up through a structure in the brain called the thalamus. Now, at this point, we know that the thalamus functions primarily as a relay center. So it takes this information, and it's kind of like Grand Central Station. It takes the information, and then it figures out where it wants to send it. So the interesting thing is where it sends it to. We used to think that the pain was located in one area of the brain, that there was one area of the brain, like vision, sight, sound, that was responsible for processing the information about pain. We now realize through scans and functional MRIs that there's not one single area of the brain that's impacted. Well, we realize that there's really this interconnected network of brain areas that get impacted when somebody has an injury. When nociceptive fibers fire, it goes to multiple areas. The interesting thing is that our brain, it sets up a normal pattern, and when we look at the normal pattern of processing pain, we see things light up. And so in a healthy brain, we see a balance of areas that are quiet, which are blue, and areas that are more active, which are red. So the question is, what areas get more red or more active when we start to experience pain? Well, the interesting thing is that there's even though it varies from person to person, and we expect to see it consistent with every person, we realize that it's not consistent with every person, because every person's experience of pain is different, and that's what makes it unique. But we do find that as we start to get more and more data, that we start to see patterns, and it's these patterns we start to look at, not necessarily the exact identical structures that get lit up when we experience pain, but instead we start to see patterns of areas that get lit up. Some people might not have it, but the majority do. And so what are those areas that primarily are lit up in people who have pain? Well, The thalamus we talked about gets lit up pretty hard because most of the information gets transmitted through there. But once it hits the thalamus, it goes to certain areas. Some of the information is transmitted to the amygdala and the hippocampus, and we'll talk about the importance of these structures as we start to take a look at our modules on chronic pain. But also what it does is it gets routed up to the primary somatosensory cortex and the secondary somatosensory cortex. And these are pretty consistently stimulated areas when people have nociceptive input put to them. But the areas that are most consistent and most meaningful for us as we start to study pain sciences are these other three areas that get lit up in people: the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. These form the hub of activity in people with chronic pain, or not chronic pain, but in processing of pain. Really the interesting thing that occurs is beyond the sensory input that goes to the primary somatosensory cortex and the secondary somatosensory cortex are the activity that occurs in this hub of more inner structures of the brain: the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. These are all structures that are located deeper within the brain and are responsible for processing of things like emotions and affect, and are responsible for processing of memory. And these are really, really important as we look at people with pain, and especially if we looked at the mechanisms that underlie chronic pain. But these are discussions we'll have as we start to talk about chronicity of pain and the differences that occur between acute pain and chronic pain as we start to look at things in the future. Now, if you look at this picture, you'll start to see where these areas are located. If you start to take a look at it, we start to see the thalamus, which is located right under that, or near that structure that says the hypothalamus. See the HYP, underneath that is the hypothalamus. You'll see the paroctoductal gray. Those are the areas we talked about where the C fibers go. But in addition to that, you'll see that once it gets routed from the thalamus, it goes to that structure called the AMG, which is a symbol for amygdala. But in addition, you'll see how it goes to the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. These are the areas you'll see how they're located deep within the brain and also in the forward aspects of the brain. And these are important as we start to talk about the meaning of these. So as we start to look at the areas, these special areas responsible for processing pain, what are they supposed to do and why are they important? Well, remember we first start to talk about the amygdala. The amygdala is important because it's an important memory structure. But in addition to memory structure, it's an important threat and fear processing information. And we'll talk about why that's important in the future. We'll start to see the somatosensory, the primary and secondary somatosensory cortex. Well, this is where sensations are processed. And we remember that when we talked about pain earlier in modules, we talked about how pain is not just about nociception, but it's also about the sensations and other environmental cues that come to our brain and is processed at the same time. So it's not unusual that these areas would be stimulated when we come in contact with the nociceptive or injury type of stimulus. But now we get to the areas that are kind of interesting because they're the components that are responsible for more of our affect and also our emotions. So if you look at the insular cortex provides emotional meaning to the stimulus, the nociceptive stimulus that we get. We get the anterior cingulate cortex, which is an integrator of emotional and sensory and nociceptive information. And what it does is it guides our autonomic responses. And then we get the medial prefrontal cortex, which stores and processes pain memories. So it takes memories that we've experienced in the past, and it allows us to modify any signals that are coming in now. But all these structures, it's important to realize that they have multiple functions. Not only do they process emotions, but all of them are very, very critical in the formation of memories and the storage of memories. And that's a key component when we start to talk about the difference between acute pain and chronic pain. So, how are these structures organized? Well, it's interesting, now that we know all these different areas that are stimulated, the next question that we had is, well, since there's not one structure that's stimulated, and there's a grouping of structures, is there any pattern or any networks in which they are stimulated? And so there's several different methods of classifying these brain activity, and different researchers and different writers have come up with different methods of categorizing them. We're going to talk about some of the ones that are coming up and seem to be more meaningful to us. Now, Bresler et al., they've taken up the mantle somewhat of talking about how you can group these areas of the brain based off function. And when we start to talk about function, you have to realize that really the brain, its job is to keep us alive. It processes all the information coming into you at one time. And what it does is it determines what is important or not. Now, whether you realize it or not, even when you're asleep, even when you're put under anesthesia, your brain is never silent. There's always a baseline amount of activity that occurs that helps keep us alive and processes information that comes in. Now, scientists have begun to call this the default mode network. This is this area that interacts with other regions of the brain, but what it does is it monitors, and it's active when the brain is at rest. So what it does is it's when the rest of the brain is relaxing, it's monitoring the environment and help keeping us alive. It's responsible for our basic functions of life. So, beyond that default network that is active at all times, they've come up with this classification called the salience network. And the salience network, what it does, it's responsible for monitoring information. So it's kind of like our body's early warning system. What it does is if a pain signal comes up or if a nociceptive signal comes up from the periphery, it will take it and it will start to activate areas of the brain. It'll say, hey, we got this signal coming in. Why don't you wake up, you wake up, you wake up, you wake up, and let's figure out what we need to do about this. So it's our early warning system. It wakes up the areas that need to respond to the stimulus and gets them working so that they can react to the threat and it can start to take appropriate actions. So beyond the salience network, then you start to get the activation of the central executive network. And the central executive network are usually these areas located more in the forward parts of our brain. And what they're responsible for is taking this initial first reaction or this first response, and what it does is it says, okay, we've gotten all our systems alerted. Let's figure out how we have to modify this. Have we seen this signal before? Is it something to be worried about? Or can we start to dampen down our alert system? Or do we have to ramp it up even higher? So its job is to modulate our initial first reactions. So this is one way of classifying the functions of the brain with pain, by activity that occurs at the default mode network, the salience network, and the central executive network. And you'll see some of the structures that are activated with these. The default mode is usually a lot of the prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex. These are responsible for a lot of, or really active with our default mode network. When we start to activate, a lot of things we do is we start to activate the anterior insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. And then when we start to modify our first original thoughts, we start to get to our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and our PPC cortex as well. Okay, and so these are the areas that are responsible for the different networks that we just talked about. Now there's another method of classifying these brain activities, and this was presented more by Saper in 2002 and Benarock in 2006. And what they said is there's a central autonomic network that's responsible for keeping our body alive. There are areas that are responsible for monitoring our environment and for just maintaining the basic level of function. And then when we have changes to these, you start to see how other areas are engaged. So in this central autonomic network that they proposed, there's really short loops of activity that are responsible for immediate, short, quick responses, and longer loops of activity that are delayed but what they do is they're designed to modulate our first initial responses. So if you start to take a look at the areas of the brain that are activated, you'll see from this picture there's the first central autonomic network or loop of activity that's responsible for keeping our body alive. And then we see with nociception, the primary loop becomes active. And then we get with more of the saliency network, you'll start to see the secondary loop start to get kicked in, which is the white loop. And then you see more of the gray loop is more responsible for the modifying of those initial responses. So it's just another way of classifying information through the different loops of activity, with each loop of activity taking a little bit longer and being a little bit more delayed in the responses. So if we look at the primary short loop of activity, that's the green loop, the nociceptive loop. It's responsible for nociceptive processing and the initial withdrawal and encoding of nociceptive information. The structures that are involved in this loop are usually the posterior cingulate cortex, the mid-cingulate, the primary sensory cortex, the primary motor cortex, and the posterior parietal cortex, the PPC. Now we get to the secondary loop, which is the medium loop of activity. Remember, this is more coordinated with what was stated before, maybe more like the saliency network. So really the saliency network is the nociceptive network and the secondary loop of activity that we see here. And this is designated in white. So it modulates our initial nociceptive responses and integrates memory, prior unpleasant experiences. It's more of a top-down modulation of initial responses. So what it does is it takes the brain and modulates our initial first responses. And it has more of a conscious control, not as much as the third loop that we see, or the tertiary loop that we'll see in a second, but it does have a component of conscious control of our nociceptive responses. The structures involved here are more of your anterior cingulate, or anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and once again the posterior parietal cortex, or the PPC. Now our last loop is the tertiary, or the long loop of activity, and this is more linked with the central executive functions of the prior functional classification. What it does is it reappraises our initial responses by monitoring past memories experienced. So this is where past exposure to pain, it influences how we respond now and in the future. We take a look at the memory through these systems, and the body goes up to those areas, says, have we seen this before? And if it's seen it before, what it does is it modulates based off that prior experience. And it reassesses, and it uses emotions to modulate these initial responses. It takes into consideration our internal states, such as proprioception, interoception, and our perceptions, the visions that we see, the sounds that we hear. So it's really integrating our environment with our past experience and helps modulate our current responses. It's really responsible for the integration of prior past memory experiences, which is really important as we start to take a look at chronic pain. The structures involved here are the anterior cingulate cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, the anterior lateral prefrontal cortex, and the ventral striatum. And this loop is classified in the gray. So that was a quick jaunt through acute pain. Now remember, this is acute pain in people who have normal responses. This is what's normal in people. When we start to take a look at what's abnormal is what the science is leading us to now, and we'll talk about those in future modules. So we look forward to sharing that information with you, so stay tuned for that. But for now, we'll see you next time.